The very first video on this channel was my Thaumaturge guide, and now I've been given an early release copy of the Remastered Thaumaturge, and I have a lot of really good things to say about the remaster of this class. Let's dive in. Hello folks, Phil Gallagher, aka Thraben, you here for another Pathfinder 2E video, and welcome to the Remastered Thaumaturge analysis and build advice video. I'm very excited for this one. I have been waiting for my copy of Dark Archive for a couple of weeks now, and it finally arrived. Thanks to Paizo for the review copy. I very much appreciate it, and I've been in touch with them since December about doing some stuff for the Remastered Thaumaturge. So before I get going here, let me just say, if you like what you see on this channel, please consider doing something to support me, even if it's just small, like subscribing to the channel or leaving a like or comment on the video. All of that stuff helps out a lot. Notably, I'm going to go ahead and release this video as soon as it is ready, so this will be replacing my normal video for this week. North Carolina is expecting some very, very bad weather, and I want to make sure that I have this information out to you ASAP. A, because it's cool, and B, a lot of you might be bored and trapped at home, so let's get you some cool content. So I'm going to be doing a handful of things today. The Dark Archive Remastered covers the Thaumaturge, the Psychic, and a handful of other cool, spooky, occult type things. My focus on this video is going to be on the Thaumaturge, especially the Wand and Chalice Implements that saw some pretty big changes. But we're also going to grade Paizo overall on their Thaumaturge. I'm going to talk about a few things that I really wish had happened and maybe will happen in the future. And then I'm going to use the final section of this video to briefly talk about the online discourse surrounding the Remastered Psychic. People have big feelings. So let's hop right into it. The Wand implement previously, honestly, was kind of weak, and it might have been difficult for someone playing a Thaumaturge to go, I actually want to do this as the main thing that my Thaumaturge is going to do. In good news, the damage for this has been pretty significantly buffed. Here is the version as of the remaster. So your base damage, at a very respectable range of 60 feet, is now 3d4 damage on a basic reflex save. But you can boost it to instead deal 3d6 damage, which at level 1 is pretty substantial. Now, the recharge time on the Fling Magic has also been improved. So it recharges at the end of your next turn, meaning that the boosted Fling Magic can now be an every other turn activity. So you boost, you fling your magic on turn 1, turn 2, you do something else, turn 3, you are ready to boost and fling again. So this does more damage and is usable more often. That is great. And as we go on, you are going to get more and more benefits for continuing to kind of level up your wand or gain Thaumaturge levels. So assuming for a moment that you're going to choose fire because you like big damage numbers, when you hit 7th level, you can start tacking on some persistent fire damage, potentially 2d10 if the enemy happens to crit fail. When you hit the intensify vulnerability later on, you get a status bonus to the damage rolls equal to your level, which immediately when you get that is a +9, just flat boost, which is pretty chonky. And at the Paragon benefit, you have absurd range, pretty much bigger than any battle map that I've played on, and you can also start doing it in a burst. And since numbers go up, let's look at how numbers go up here. So let's compare 4 things. The normal use of the wand that is not boosted, the wand use that is boosted, a 2d4 cantrip, and a 2d6 per spell rank spell, which is kind of the baseline for spell damage. At first level, when you first get these things, your normal use of the wand is going to outperform a single target 2d4 cantrip. So if you are, say, casting an electric arc on just one target, the wand should deal more damage. And if you look at the boosted wand, that damage is very chunky. you are getting 3d6 damage there, which is probably going to outperform most first rank spells. Now, in parentheses here, I have the expected damage that you should get by adding more dice each time you level up. So when we compare this at level 2, our normal at spell rank 2, in other words, player level 3, your regular wand still outperforming your cantrip here. But you can see that the spell slots are starting to pull ahead and will continue to pull ahead for a little while. The wand boost damage is still quite good. In fact, nearly double the amount of damage of just casting a traditional cantrip. On rank with the spells here, but behind here. When we reach 7th level and we hit these rank 4 spells, we start getting persistent fire damage being added to the mix, again, assuming fire because damage number go up, make brain feel good. And how exactly you want to count that fire damage in terms of the calculation here is a little fuzzy, because you're getting the 1d10 on a failure, you're getting 2d10 persistent fire damage on a critical failure, but nothing on a success or critical success there. So I'm just going to leave those separate, and you can decide, like, do I want to call that a 5.5? Do I want to say that that is going to tick 3 times before it goes away? Kind of leave that up to you. The off-the-cuff thing that is being said online is that the wand implement is somewhere between a cantrip and a spell slot. And while that is true, I think it is much closer to a max rank spell than it is to a cantrip. Like, if we are comparing wand boost to max rank spells, like these are in roughly the same ballpark. And when we move up to rank 5 and we can start thinking about adding the intensify vulnerability into the mix, the damage that you can get is very, very chonky. The 2d6 rank per spell level, 2d6 damage per spell rank, all right, let's use the terminology, right, is dealing about 35 average damage, whereas you're getting 33.5 here with a d10 of persistent fire damage. So as a player, I think I would be pretty darn happy boosting my wand and doing that as a 2-action activity. Like, you can get damage similar to what spellcasters can get with their spells by just something you are taking with your class features. That's kind of cool. And this, I think, actually opens a legitimate ranged Thaumaturge build that is interesting and potentially quite dynamic. And it's not like using the wand normally is embarrassing either. This is still a noticeable amount of damage if you are using Intensify Vulnerability, but damage is obviously better every other turn when you can boost. So I think our conclusion here is that, like, this is noticeably better than a cantrip and probably competitive with max rank spells on damage specifically. Now, when we start getting to these rank 4 and rank 5 spells, a lot of these spells are going to come with things like status effects, many of which can be gross. You start to see things like decent values of frightened and slowed or sickened coming around, and a ton of utility. So I don't think the Thaumaturge's wand implement is keeping up with casters in terms of all their flexibility. The wand is always going to target reflex. The wand can't change damage types nearly as much as a spellcaster can with their spell slots. The spellcasters might be doing their damage in an area rather than to a single target. So it's not like the Thaumaturge is stepping on the caster's toes here. But I think the wand went from something that is a little questionable to pick to something that is, like, actually quite good. Something that's kind of weird here, though, is that the Thaumaturge class is built around exploit vulnerability. And for quite some time, exploit vulnerability is going to have no impact on your wand, which feels awkward. And I wonder if that means you have some very strange things that you can do with a thaumaturge. Normally, you basically need to have a hand empty or just be using implements in order to get some of the benefits. But if you benefits of your thaumaturge class features. But if you're not intending on striking and benefiting from exploit vulnerability and your primary activity is going to be exploit vulnerability, I wonder if there are avenues towards building thaumaturges that don't look like the thaumaturges of the past because you're not as limited by what is going on with your hands. Now, this might change later on when you get to the point of using intensify vulnerability, but maybe there's some new early game options here that arise as a result from the wand being significantly buffed. I will say if you are going down this route, please watch for the Esoterica tag, as that might end up being very, very impactful on what you can and can't do. But we don't want to just evaluate the wand implement in a vacuum. Numbers look respectable. You're not going to be embarrassed going around flinging magic. I think the boost turns are quite good. But what do your off turns look like? Are you still willing to fling magic at the lower damage thresholds on the non-boost turns? Are you going to be wielding a one-handed ranged weapon? And for those of you playing Starfinder 2E stuff as well, I think the Thaumaturge in space can end up being very cool, where you can have pretty impressive damage output with a one-handed ranged gun and the boost fling magic. That sounds like a lot of fun. And if you are only playing with Pathfinder 2E materials, you do have some weak ranged weapons that you could think about. You could use a gun that might require you to go into an archetype to get some amount of action compression for that gun. Thaumaturges are relatively action starved. More on that later in this video. I wonder if you can build sort of a support caster thaumaturge that uses fling magic for damage. So you intend on opening with a fling magic, and then your off turns are support turns, using things like items, taking advantage of the fact that the thaumaturge can have more invested items than normal and could potentially activate them more times. Maybe you can have a bunch of scrolls that you use for support. Maybe you can take something like the captain archetype that takes advantage of your charisma, and you can have a humanoid companion that you command around, and that rounds out your action economy on the turns that you don't really want to be using the non-boosted fling magic. I also wonder if this is just a good way to build a switch hitter thaumaturge. Something I've talked about in terms of tactics previously is like make the enemy use the move actions, don't use the move actions yourself. And if the thaumaturge is action starved, all right, I'm going to do something like on my first turn, fling magic at you, take a recall knowledge action, and then you're going to come to me. Well, now you're in close quarters, so I will just go ahead and switch to my melee weapon and just start beating on you. All right, I downed you. Now I'm going to fling magic at someone else until they walk up to me, and you try to effectively not take movement actions by having a really good ranged option. And if it naturally kind of breaks down that you fling magic with boost, someone comes to you, you hit them for a turn or two, and then you end up boosting again and, doing some other action with the rest of your turn, this could end up being pretty viable. Now, let's step outside of raw for a minute and into the realm of rule of cool and house rules. Now, obviously, if you're playing in something like Pathfinder Society, you're going to play everything raw, unless it just is like crazy and doesn't make sense. I think if I were playing at a home table and I wanted to play a wand implement, I would ask my GM about giving me a little leeway with breach defenses. This is a feat that is not particularly strong, and I'm going to read the bottom part down here. So, let's imagine that you succeed at exploit vulnerability and you learn that the creature has a resistance. Choose one such resistance. Your unarmed and weapon strikes bypass the chosen resistance. I think it would be really cool to play a switch hitter thaumaturge that can boost magic and fling magic, and then someone walks up to them and they're like, Oh no, my fire wasn't effective against you. Whack. Haha, now it's effective against you. Boom. I think that's super cool. So I think asking your your GM, hey, can my wand implement ignore the resistance here if I go and take breach defenses? I think that's a totally cool and flavorful ask. And I think this is especially important because a lot of thaumaturges are only going to have one damage type for their wand for a little while. And if you pick fire, which has the cool persistent fire damage, well, fire tends to be heavily resisted by enemies. So having within your class chassis the ability to go, I can get around that, can keep your implement viable. And since breach defenses is a level 4 feat, that can tide you over until 7th level when you can end up taking a second element for your wand. And this seems fun to me. Again, outside of the realm of raw, but I think well within reason to generate a cool build. The other implement that really deserves a lot of analysis now is the chalice. Previously, the numbers here were unimpressive and a little disappointing, and they have received kind of buffs across the board. So now, when you sip from the chalice, you can give out temporary hit points equal to your level. And when you drain it, you are healing the drinker instead for 3 hit points for each level you have. But this is essentially going to be a once per combat activity. When you get the adept benefit at 7th level, the sip now increases the temporary hit points equal to twice your level. Pretty big jump up. And when drained, the chalice heals the creature 5 hit points for each level you have, instead of the 3 that it was previously. And when you hit 9th level and you get the Intensify vulnerability benefits, you add additional temp HP on top of what you normally would add, equal to your level, or twice your level to the hit points regained if the drinker drains the chalice. So numbers look better, but this is a time where, again, I think we want to compare the numbers. And if you'll excuse me, I'm going to disappear because the next chart is big. So we have draining the chalice here in comparison to various healing activities that you might commonly see. So we're going to compare this to 1 action heal, which is 1d8, 2 action heal, which is 1d8 plus 8, and then to the relevant potions and elixirs that you might come across within the same level range. At level 1, the chalice draining is unimpressive. Like, it is worse than a 2 action heal, it is worse than a potion, it is worse than an elixir, significantly worse than a 2 action heal. Once you level up 1, you again get to just add 3 more to that healing. So now you outperform a 1 action heal, and you outperform the level relevant potion or elixir. You're still noticeably worse than a 2 action heal. And you'll see that every time you level up, you kind of have to reevaluate where exactly the healing is at. So we were behind 1 action heal, ahead of 1 action heal, tied with 1 action heal, ahead of 2 action healed. You can kind of see that it's boomeranging a little bit. And the level progression for things like potions is not necessarily constant. So sometimes those potions are going to jump up significantly, and then you are eventually going to very significantly outpace those things. When you hit level 7, and again when you hit level 9, you're going to see the implement benefits kick in again, assuming that you are continuing down the path of the chalice. And all of a sudden, when you drain the chalice, it is a chunky amount of healing. And over the course of these first couple of levels, you kind of go from being similar to a 1 action heal to being nearly double that of a 1 action heal. And you make up quite a bit of ground on even a 2 action heal. And at this point, you are well past the on-level consumables in terms of how much healing the chalice is going to do. When you reach 9th level, assuming that you are doing Intensify Vulnerability, the amount of healing that you get from draining the chalice is kind of crazy. It actually outperforms a 2-action heal, and when you level up another time to level 10, like you are, another die worth of healing ahead of a 2-action heal, and over double that of an elixir and nearly triple that of a potion. So draining the chalice is a very, very real amount of healing. How does the temporary HP look, though, that you get from just sipping the chalice? And now I can come back. The amount of HP that you get does not scale up well in the early game because you are adding temporary hit points equal to your level minimum of 3. So at level 1, getting to add 3 temporary hit points each turn, pretty cool. At level 3, adding 3 temporary hit points per turn, slightly less cool. Again, at levels 7 and 9, when you get the adept benefits and then intensify vulnerability benefits, the amount of temporary hit points that you can get does jump up very, very noticeably. So previously, I kind of thought that the temporary hit points from the chalice were borderline negligible. Now I would say that they are closer to real. Is this going to be the best way to get temporary hit points? Maybe not. But for something that you can do every single turn, this is pretty respectable. I think a good point of comparison here is kind of thinking about things that your casters might be using as reactions at these appropriate levels, where a lot of things like your hidebounds and your warping pulls might save about 5 points of damage by giving you resistance 5. Now they can do that as a reaction, but as an action, you can just go like, hey, here's, 5 to 14 temporary hit points. This will probably shrug off a good chunk of a hit, or maybe even an entire hit once we start getting into this amount of temporary hit points. So overall, I think the chalice got a lot better. I think the numbers on the healing from draining the chalice look solid, and I think they get better over time. The once per encounter nature of the draining, though, means that you are not a healer. It means that you have a big heal in your toolkit as a martial character, which is cool, but this is not enough to make you the healer. You're not going to be able to get everyone up with this. And I think if you want to play a Thaumaturge who has a focus on healing, the Chalice Implement is a great place to start, but you probably need to be thinking about having battle medicine, a medic dedication, godless healing, healer's gloves, potion patches, that sort of stuff to help out here. I wonder if you can make a very, very defensive Thaumaturge here, using something like a shield implement and a chalice implement at the same time. So you get temporary hit points and you also get to shield block. That could make you quite difficult to kill, in the same way that an exemplar who takes 2 defensive icons is very difficult to kill. So for example, if you have the Scar of the Survivor that heals you and the Legally Distinct Craven Edge, and the Barrow's Edge icon, you could be transcending and healing just about every turn. I wonder if a Thaumaturge could play out in a similar way, where you can make one that is rather hard to kill. Now, I will say here, flipping back a couple of slides, the Chalice does have the Manipulate action, which means that if you are in melee and you are trying to use this temporary HP to keep yourself up, when you try to sip from the chalice, that will provoke a reactive strike. And this is something that I'm going to loop back to later in this video. And one more time, let's do the rule of cool thing that is not raw, but something that I might be thinking about, because a lot of Thaumaturge feats are honestly a little sketchy. So I'm just going to read the full relevant text here for one more activation. Once each day, you can activate an item you've invested even after you've used that activation the maximum number of times for its frequency. You can only do so if the item's level is half your level or lower, the activation has a frequency of once per day or more frequent, and you already haven't used the activation this round. There's a lot of strings attached to this feat. So let's imagine that you are level 6. You can activate a level 3 item an additional time. that is not overly exciting. And additionally, it also has to be an invested item, which not all items are. And the one more activation feat is something that sounds super, super cool, and then in reality, it doesn't play out quite the same way in actual play if you play this one raw. Let's say someone is taking a Chalice Thaumaturge, and they take the one more activation feat. Would I let them drain their Chalice one additional time per combat? Or rather, one additional time once each day? Yeah, I think that's totally reasonable as a non-raw rule of cool thing. Is your implement an invested item? No. Is that implement, does that implement even have an item level if it is just something you get for free at character creation? Maybe not. But in the hopes of making some of these Thaumaturge feats more viable in things that are not stuff like Pathfinder Society play that have to follow raw, this is something else that I might think about saying like, hey GM, how would you feel about my Chalice being a little bit closer to bottomless? And I want to quick hit two other relevant changes. The first is from the mirror, and specifically its adept benefit at level 7. It used to be that when an enemy hits your mirror's reflection, it always used to shatter, and you did not have a choice about that, which could be incredibly awkward in actual play situations. Now, instead, it is a free action that you can do when an enemy damages either you or your reflection. This is, I think, a very, very good change. This was something that I specifically called out as being awkward in my original Thaumaturge guide that I made for this channel. So big thumbs up here to Paizo on that one. That is a great change. The other thing that I noticed was that paired link has changed. This was a feat that I didn't really view as ever takeable previously, and now it's a bit more interesting. So, during your daily preparations, you perform a short ceremony where you gift one of the two halves of this paired link thing to a willing ally. On that ally, you can cast spells and use Thaumaturge abilities targeting your paired ally as though you are adjacent to each other, and the ally can cast spells targeting you in the same way. This is neat. The range here used to be something like 30 feet, and now it's just as if you're adjacent. No range limitation. Which, as a GM, makes me really want to make a Thaumaturge BBEG that just gives out an amulet each day to the enemy that is going to come and harass you, and they will give that enemy temp HP from even outside of things like line of sight, I think. I think that's valid. It's just as if you are adjacent to each other. There may be some buried rules minutia here in other stuff around that makes that not valid, but I think paired link went from why would you ever take this to, I wonder if there are niche circumstances where being able to hand out the temp HP from Chalice as if that person is next to me can become quite powerful. The adept benefit for the mirror, I think, is a major change, and paired link gets a relevant buff that might make it takeable now. So as we reach the end of my section on the Thaumaturge here, let's grade Paizo. How did they do on the Thaumaturge Remaster? And I think as a starting point, we should say what the Thaumaturge was like pre-remaster. And I think the answer is that it was in about the top third of the classes, maybe somewhere around a top 10 class, depending on what exactly you value. There's a lot of powerful things within the Thaumaturge, especially their esoteric lore and diverse lore feats. Scroll Thaumaturgy is incredibly powerful. Being a charisma marshal is interesting and makes you rather good at demoralizing innately. You have face stuff while having a lot of utility. There's a lot to like about this class. And so I don't think major changes were necessary, and that going into this, Paizo just needed to make some tweaks. And I think they succeeded on that. I'd even give them the critical success here. I think the floor was raised on the bad implements, and I think the build viability on Thaumaturges has increased without necessarily increasing the raw power of the class. So I don't think we saw power creep with this remaster. I don't think the Thaumaturge as a whole got stronger. I think a lot of the builds that players might have started and then gone, I don't know if I made a good choice here. I think a lot of the like trap decisions have gone away and build viability has increased. I give Paizo an A on their remaster of the Thaumaturge. I think this was a slam dunk and exactly what they needed to do. But we can always wish for more, right? My wish list is small. There are two things that I would love to see in the future. Number one, I would love some sort of feat or feature on the Thaumaturge that makes it so that the manipulate actions specifically from your implements don't trigger reactive strikes. I think it's a little silly that I'm going to take a little swig here to make it so that I don't go down. Oh no, enemy reactive strike, I go down. That feels silly to me. Similarly, oh no, my ally is in danger. I'm going to raise my amulet and I get hit with a reactive strike. Those feel kind of bad to me in comparison to something like a champion's reaction. The other thing that I would love to see in the future is more flourish trait feats that offer the Thaumaturge action compression. The Thaumaturge has a lot to do. Even just at level 1, assuming that you have an active implement of some kind, you might be thinking about striking, demoralizing, striding, exploiting vulnerability, activating your implement, making actual factual recall knowledge checks. And that's before we start getting into other things that you might be getting, such as scrolls from Scroll Thaumaturgy, intensify vulnerability later on, and if you have multiple different implements that you want to activate, it might be very hard to do all of the things that you want to do. And that was something that I experienced a lot in playing my own Thaumaturge. But again, Paizo gets the A here. They did a very good job in remastering the Thaumaturge. So now we're going to talk about the Psychic very quickly in comparison to the Thaumaturge, which was the focus of this video from my perspective. So the Psychic dedication really got nerfed. It no longer gives you a focus point when you take the dedication. You are now getting a Psy cantrip, but not the ability to amp it, which requires that focus point. If you want to get that focus point and the ability to amp your cantrips, you need to be taking a follow-up feat at level 6. And this is a very, very big change. I think this is a system impacting change or a metagame impacting change, however you want to think about that. I think casters that are not psychics very frequently took a psychic dedication just as a feat that read gain a focus point, because many classes have trouble getting 3 focus points, especially doing so quickly within their own class. And Maguses loved to dip into Psychic to get amped imaginary weapon as something that they can spell strike with. And that is fully dead for a number of reasons. More on that in a second. And in terms of power gaming, something that was very common on characters that I was drafting up was just making them Ancient Elf, because that was just a way to get another focus point immediately at level 1. And especially if you have a good focus spell that you want to use, this was just a very low cost way to really make your spells go further in a day. Or if you are a class that has focus points, but not necessarily a great focus spell, Summoner comes to mind here. Taking an Ancient Elf dip into Psychic at level 1 could let you, instead of just going like, okay, I'm going to make my Eidolon slightly better, like, no, now I get an amp Daze, and my Primal Caster now has a great thing to target the will saves for the entire game. Or I can get amped Frostbite, I get something that does slightly better damage, and I can also get some temporary HP that can help both me and my Eidolon. And I think the Psychic dedication being heavily nerfed is actually a good thing. I'm going to give Paizo an A in that regard, which may sound a little strange. But I think the Psychic dedication was maybe a little bit unhealthy. I think it was very, very, very strong. And this is going to do a lot of damage to builds that people have put together. Like, I know that I have to retrain 2 of my characters based on this decision. One of them is a Pathfinder Society character, a summoner, and the other is my Witch Warper who just leveled up, and I took multi-talented at level 9 so that I could get an extra focus point via the Psychic archetype. So I have to decide what I'm going to do with that, or just see, like, hey, are we just going to roll with this until this campaign is over? So I think a lot of changes are going to happen to a ton of people's characters as a result of this. And I'm very happy that this is the result, because I think this is going to cause builds to be more unique. But what about the Psychic class itself? It wasn't really buffed, and the community is pretty mad about this. And if you go on a place like Reddit, there are a lot of threads with hundreds upon hundreds of upvotes discussing the changes or lack thereof about the Psychic, and most of them are just complaining. And I'll leave it up to you whether or not you think the complaints are justified. I think if you want a really good analysis of this, I recommend Pathfinder's preview video on the Psychic. It combats some of the disinformation that is going around in those threads, and I think gives a pretty good nuanced view about the situation, sort of in the same way that I did for the Thaumaturge today, he did for the Psychic. So check out his video if you want to kind of know all of the changes about the Psychic. But honestly, there weren't very many. And if you're interested about some of the rules nuance of things like, hey, Spell Strike, what's going on with that now? Pathfinder covers it really well. So in thinking about the future of this class, I'm a little unsure what's going to happen. Because in the past, so many characters have dipped into Psychic for access to their focus spells. And that used to be doable at level 1 via Ancient Elf, or level 2 by just taking the dedication instead of your class feat, even if you're not in a free archetype game. Well, are we going to see more people actually choose to play Psychics now that people can't just very quickly and easily poach their best features? And I'm not sure if the answer is yes. Anecdotally, I can tell you that I have never seen a Psychic in Pathfinder Society play. I have seen a ton of Pathfinder Society characters with Psychic dedications. I've seen a ton of imaginary weapon maguses. I've seen a rogue with a imaginary weapon build off the Eldritch Trickster rogue. I've seen a ton of people taking a Psychic dedication for the extra focus points. I've never seen a full-on Psychic. I've played a handful of scenarios and one-shots with Psychics, and with Psychics at the table. Those weren't Pathfinder Society play, those were my home games, and the Psychic seemed like a reasonable class. More on that in just a second, though. I think when we get Impossible Magic over the summer, I think we are going to see a lot of people who would want to play a Psychic choose to play a Necromancer instead. The Necromancer is also a 2-slot per level caster, at least as of playtest. They also have amazing focus spells. Arguably, their focus spells are better than the focus spells of the Psychic, and they get a very, very good range of what they can do with those focus spells. They get a consistent 1-action cantrip attack in the form of Create Thrall. That also helps to set up some of their other abilities. And they get the ability to consume a Thrall for a bonus focus point as well. And I think a lot of people are going to look at the Necromancer and go, oh, damn, that's sweet. I want to play that class. And I think given a lot of the recent online discourse about the disappointment of the remastered Psychic, I don't know if a lot of people are going to pick Psychic once Impossible Magic releases. So while I give Paizo an A for their remaster of the Psychic, I'm going to overall give them a C for their remaster of the Psychic. Like, they did a great job with the Thaumaturge. I'm not impressed here, though. I love what they did with the Psychic dedication, and I give them an A in that regard. But as far as the overall impression I have of the Psychic, it is negative here. I think the Psychic is still a viable class. I think if you choose to play a Psychic, you are still going to have a good time playing that class. But if you are going to consistently be comparing yourself to other casters, I don't know that the Psychic keeps up with modern design. And when I think about casters released after the Animist, I have been very, very impressed by them in a way that I'm not impressed by this remastered Psychic. The Animist feels like the best class in the entire system to me. And if you think about the Starfinder 2E casters like the Mystic and the Witch Warper, they are so incredibly solid compared to the Psychic. And I think there were a ton of opportunities here to do small things that could have made the Psychic noticeably better. There are a lot of Psychic feats that really and truly do very close to nothing. And I think juicing up some of those low-level Psychic feats would have been great. I think you could start the Psychic as a class that just has 3 focus points by default. That's a way to power them up in the early game as well. You could make Unleash Psyche last longer so that people can expect to be in it for most of a battle, rather than like, oh no, what happens if I become stupefied? And there are a handful of Psychic feats that impact a relatively large area, but hit everything in the area, which can be very awkward in terms of friendly fire. So adjusting some of those feats so that they only targeted enemies would have been another really good way to give the Psychic a small buff that made them stand out. So what is your impression of the remastered Thaumaturge and Psychic? I legitimately would like to hear them. I have been enjoying the online discourse that is going on. I am finding the different viewpoints pretty fascinating. So let me know what you think down in the comments below, and I hope you all have a great rest of the day. See ya.